Hello Cave Dwellers, we continue our work on the world's newest Amiga today, and I have to say it hasn't been an inexpensive series to make. From the components to the case to the upgrades that you're going to see today, the cost all adds up and a lot of skills have been involved, so that's why I'm really happy to say that Skillshare has sponsored this series to make it possible. I often pop onto Skillshare to learn and refresh my own skills, from electronics and soldering to video editing in Premiere and fixing up audio in Audacity. There's over 30,000 courses to choose from, and if you use the link below you can bag yourself 2 months of free premium access to see what new skills you can pick up. No more hot classrooms down at the local college where you doze off halfway through the course. At least that's what I did. I'm sure I'm not the only one. Check it out, and thank you to Skillshare for supporting the series and making this build possible. Now, on with the show. Hello Cave Dwellers, welcome to the Cave for part 3 of our series on building the newest Amiga in the world. In part 1 we checked out the Checkmate 1500 Plus case, a brand new case for PCs and for Amigas. In part 2 we built the A500 the purple beast, which is nestled in here, the newest Amiga in the world. And today we really go to town on adding as many upgrades as possible to make this the most up-to-date, the most powerful Amiga that I possibly can. And when it comes to upgrades for Amigas, they don't come much more powerful than this. What's in this box is version 2 of the Amiga 500 Vampire card. It's an FPGA based CPU replacement for the Motorola 68000 CPU that's normally found in an Amiga 500, running at around 7 MHz. So while it's not an authentic Motorola CPU, at the logic level it's pretty much as good as the real thing. And it's not a straight swap out. This is not a 68000, it's not a 68020 as found in the Amiga 1200, it's not a 68040 as found in the top of the line Amiga 4000. No, this is a Motorola 68080 clocked at 80 MHz. And that's a stratospheric performance increase, which is 3 to 4 times faster than even the fastest 68060 CPU and over 100 times faster than our original spec Amiga 500. All the while retaining code compatibility. And it doesn't stop with the CPU. This board also gives us 128 megs of additional RAM and an all-important IDE hard disk controller. You can see the pins there on the board, something which was lacking in the original A500. There's also a micro SD card slot here which you can use for additional storage. At the time of installing this, you can't actually boot from that slot. It's only available as additional storage to what you put on the IDE ports. But that may well become possible once some drivers are available to do so. Either way, we have options. And finally, this thing gives us retargetable graphics, or RTG, via this HDMI port. While we can still use classic applications through the DB23 port, we also have the option of using this HDMI port for higher resolutions, more colours and crisp digital output, the likes of which we've never seen before on an Amiga 500, or at least not here in the Cave. And of course the whole thing can be reconfigured. This thing being FPGA based, we can update the core to add new features as and when they become available, much like the FPGA chip we saw in the recent Mister review. That was a Cyclone 5 chip. This is the smaller Cyclone 3 chip, which has fewer logic elements, but plenty enough for the task at hand. Now I have to admit I was quite tentative about going for the Vampire for this project, and the reason being that it's FPGA based, so I was under the impression that the Vampire did as the name implied and bit into the Amiga and took control of everything, meaning that all of these custom chips wouldn't be touched at all. Now what's the point of going to the effort of building a brand new Amiga from the ground up if none of it's going to be used and it's all going to be done in the Vampire? Well, those myths, if you like, were put to rest when I looked into it a bit more, and I found that there are several upgrade paths that you can follow. Yes, you can go for the V3 core updates, which you can download from the website, flash onto the Vampire, and in that case it does some crazy stuff. It adds things like the AGA chipset, which you could never have dreamed of having in an Amiga 500. That was strictly for the 1200 and the 4000 and the CD32. But if you stick to the version 2 core updates, then it does exactly what I've explained to you. Hard drive controller, super fast CPU update, HDMI output and the extra storage options. That's all it's doing. The rest of the Amiga is still operating. Those custom chips are still heating up, being used, and all of that effort isn't wasted. So if we stick to V2, I'm happy with that. Now that thinking all comes together with version 4 of the Vampire, which is to be launched at Amiga 34 in Germany this month, I believe. And what that is a standalone Vampire. So very soon you'll be able to buy this as an Amiga on a single board, which I'm sure with a bit of customization you'll be able to mount in this case if you want to go down that path, and who knows what kind of speed and extras that will bring. But for today's build, the 500 V2 Vampire and the version 2 core updates is where we're sticking to. So let's get it installed and see what it can do.
Before we put the Vampire in, then we'll pick up where we left off in part 2, in which you'll recall I only had 512k of chip RAM installed. The Amiga has chip memory, which the custom chips can use, and fast memory, which is exclusive to the CPU, and the Vampire gives us lots of fast memory, so it's in our interests to increase that chip RAM. It's a modern build, so here's a modern solution. Modern RAM chips adapted to work in the 500 Plus, so we don't need to salvage 30-year-old chips for the task. It comes thanks to Kai Robinson, and a link to it can be found in the description, as well as everything else you see in the series. I'll carefully drop that in place, and now we have 1 meg of chip RAM. Nice and simple. The Vampire sits in the CPU socket, so I've removed that, and the manual, yes, I'm getting good at reading them now, the manual advises you to remove the Kickstart ROM, so that's also disappeared. The Vampire then presses into the CPU socket. It looks large, but it does fit inside a normal A500 case, it's not big box specific. How though do we access the HDMI port that's inside the machine on the Vampire? To do that we need to make some A-team style modifications to make the whole design a little bit more usable. I've got hold of a cheap PC USB extension here, and I'm going to hack it up for our needs. Notice the ports are held in with screws. These are panel mount USB ports, and if you're considering doing this, then panel mount is the key search term to find any kind of port really that screws in this way. These USB ports attach to an internal header on a PC motherboard, and that's no use for us here, so we'll remove those. And I will be adding in HDMI and a USB extension, both of which you can see have screw holes in the right place. Why do I need USB? Well, that takes us to our next modification, which is this board. This sits in the odd CIA slot. That's the CIA chip which controls the Amiga's keyboard, and it brings to the build a USB keyboard interface, which it does while still letting us use the normal Amiga keyboard, so we have the luxury of old or new depending on our mood, or even both at the same time. Cheeky. A small issue though is that an HDMI port is larger than a USB port, so it's time for a little surgery with a hacksaw blade. When I'm finished, it's a bit rough around the edges, but it's nice and solid once screwed in. The USB extension then fits straight in, that's a like-for-like swap out, and I've decided to trigger your OCD by having non-matching screws. Okay, stop writing that comment, I will fix it for you now. Better? Good. There's no movement on the ports, they're really securely in place, and as the Checkmate case is built for PCs as well as Amigas, it accommodates the width of that backplane with no modification required. I'll go ahead now and plug the HDMI extension into the Vampire. And pop that keyboard controller into the CIA socket, reuniting it with the CIA chip on top. We then plug in the USB extension port, and this part of our build is complete.
So that's the Vampire in, the keyboard controller, the lovely ports at the back and all the cabling. I'm happy with that. What we've got to do next is add some kind of storage device. I mentioned earlier you can't use the SD card as a bootable device, so we have to come off the IDE port. That's a 44-pin IDE port, so you need the kind of cable that you would traditionally have found in an Amiga or in a laptop rather than the larger 40-pin cable. And on the end of that cable I've got an SD card adapter. The reason for that is you could go with compact flash, you could go for a spinning hard drive, but I've gone for this so that I can put this extending ribbon cable into it, and then I can put a micro SD card wherever I want. And in this case I want it to be accessible from the front of the case, so I'm going to extend it around the front, cut a hole in the front, and hopefully get a good finish so that we can pop that card in and out, which will be quite an infrequent event, but when I do it, it will be nicer than having to take the lid off. So let's see if we can do that nicely, and if that all goes well, then we'll think about a CD drive and we're all finished up and ready for testing. So let's get this in now.
The Checkmate case is designed with flexibility in mind, and that's why it has this front plate which can be removed and modified to suit. After some careful measuring, I took the hacksaw to this plate to cut it down to size. And of course, an alternative if you have a 3D printer is to print your own plate to the exact measurements that you need. Once cut down, to secure the card slot in place, I've opted to use adhesive Velcro, just because it makes it easy to rip out if I need to. It holds the reader in place nicely, and there is a small amount of movement when putting the card in and out, but that's good for the vibrations when it spins the card up to read it. I think I will put a touch of hot glue at the back of it just to stop that movement, but I'm happy overall with the practicality of having this here. The ribbon from the extended card slot then works its way all the way back through the case to a regular SD card to IDE converter board, which in turn plugs into the IDE port of the Vampire. One thing that's missing from both the Vampire and the SD card reader is any kind of disk activity pins, and of course the A500 itself only had activity lights for the floppy disk drive, so it's not a showstopper, but something I would like to fix before the end of the series is to get a hard drive activity light working. Does this build need a CD drive? Well, not especially, let's be honest, but I did have an A570 CD-ROM drive on my Amiga back in the day, so I've got some quite fond memories of trawling through CDs full of public domain software. CDs I still have, so I kind of like the idea of being able to do it again. So we'll lose the floppy drive faceplate, and we'll swap that around with a CD faceplate. This really comes down to personal preference. You could use the second slot on the front of the case if you wanted to retain both the floppy drive and a CD drive, or you could put your floppy emulator in there. It's completely flexible. My choice of CD drive is, well, it's actually a DVD writer. It's an LG branded slimline drive model number GS40N. If we pair it up with the Checkmate drive tray, then it lines up perfectly with the slot on the faceplate, and a small hole also lines up with the eject button, so you can stab a paperclip through in an emergency if you need to eject and soft eject doesn't work. The final question then before testing is, how do we connect the CD or DVD drive up to the Amiga? And that was a lot trickier than I anticipated. I could happily have taken the hacksaw to this drive too, and I'll explain why now.
How can a man build an Amiga 500 from scratch and then be unable to set the CD-ROM drive up? It seems like the simplest thing in the world in comparison, but that's where I sit right now. The CD-ROM drive is a slot loading CD drive so that it would work with the case and keep that nice look. And it has a slimline SATA port. That's not a problem. We can quickly adapt that with this to be full size. Job one done. The next job then is to convert it to IDE, and I've got through no less than 3 SATA to IDE converter cards, and none of them work. The first one clearly was my fault because it's completely passive. It doesn't provide any power to the CD drive to spin up. It was never going to work. That's my fault. I'll take that one on the chin. But the other two seemed much more promising. This yellow board here promised to do everything that I needed of it. It has a power input, and indeed the CD-ROM drive span up and would eject and take the CD. Great, but I just couldn't get any data detected by the Amiga. Even if I took the SD card reader out and had it as standalone, it just wouldn't show up. I couldn't do anything with it. So I moved on to the next one, and this is a card which I've seen used on YouTube successfully. It's super cheap. It's less than £4, and well, same result. It puts power in, it doesn't give me any data. So I thought maybe it's something to do with the Vampire. Let's try a different method, and I had to dig around and I found this. This is an individual computer's Buddha IDE controller. Plugged it in, the Amiga detects it. If I plug a hard drive into it, it boots from it, so that's working fine. If I plug the CD drive into it, absolutely nothing. Even with all the correct drivers installed, I just cannot get this CD-ROM drive to work. So I think I need to come back to it. It's one of those where you need to clear your head, get rid of the anger, and come back and tackle it again a little bit later. So that's what we'll do. We will come back to it. I do want to get this working. If you've got any suggestions to help me, let me know. But right now, I think we're going to get the hard drive set up properly, and we're going to put this through its paces and finally see the Vampire working.
Now this isn't a tutorial on setting up our SD card for the Vampire, but if it were, it would contain 2 steps. Step 1, download Coffin OS from Apollo. Step 2, write it to your SD card. But it really is that simple. Coffin OS is a highly customized version of Amiga OS 3.9, which is packed full of software. In fact, I may never need to put anything else on this Amiga ever again. The legality of this download is questionable. I'm not sure Apollo have the rights to distribute all 32 gigabytes of it, but it's there. We can then put the card into our Amiga and of course add a case sticker to the Checkmate for that final touch before power on. You'll also notice I've added the optional keyboard garage, which as it happens is the perfect space to slot that external Gotek drive, and a wireless keyboard, the receiver for which is in the USB port we added at the back. You'd never guess there was an Amiga 500 in there, would you? Coffin OS gives us a very modern look and feel to this aging operating system, and I've used accelerated Amigas before, but none that feel quite like this. It really is quite odd that a 30-year-old machine can be made to perform in this way, and I just love it. First things first then, a speed test with sysinfo, and we are off the scale for speed here. 188 times faster than a stock A600, nearly 5.5 times faster than an Amiga 4000, so I make this an Amiga 22000 based on those results. And the author of sysinfo comments, "Phone me now," because he wants a slice of this hot Amiga action, and who wouldn't? What that speed equates to in real terms is not just a lightning fast workbench experience, but brand new experiences my old 500 could never have dreamed of, such as Doom running at over 30 frames per second, or in fact running at all. And it even makes a good go of Quake. This is entirely software rendered, remember, there's no 3D acceleration present to help it along. There is so much to learn about this new setup that I've decided we need one more episode in the series. An episode dedicated to all things I've discovered I enjoy doing on this machine as an old school A500 owner, having all this power dropped on him at once. Why don't I make it now? Well, because I need to use it. I need some time to get familiar with it all to find out what I like and what I don't like about the whole setup. The options the Vampire presents and the limits we can push this to, whether it be in original games rejuvenated by the speed, or through running emulators to play games like Alone in the Dark on an Apple Mac. Or would you believe it? Duke Nukem 3D. And yes, this is all captured directly from our A500 on the desk here.
And so my first impressions of this machine, simply ones of awe. It's incredible how fast they've pushed it with the Vampire, but we've only just scratched the surface, so there's lots more that we need to discover together, and there's still 3 things that we need to fix up. Number 1, I want that hard drive activity light working for obvious reasons. Number 2, that CD drive will not beat me. We will get that working, and I want a working CD drive in here. And that keyboard, it works great, and it works in parallel with the old keyboard in the case, so you can use both at once if you want to, but I want something a bit more suitable. And something that I've noticed recently is this. Take a look. This is not yet available. It's an Amiga branded model from the company Simulant, and it's not out yet because they're trying to secure the rights to make it a reality and to do it legally, but I sure would love that to happen. So check them out and show your support to them over on their website at simulant.uk. A nice cream keyboard would be a good finishing touch, I think, to complete the whole build, and you don't lose any functionality with a modern keyboard. By using the adapter we've got, you can still do things like press Ctrl Alt and Delete on a modern keyboard, which gives you the equivalent of Control Amiga on the real keyboard, and it will reset the machine. So I haven't found any functionality that we've lost so far by doing it that way. If you'd like to recreate this build for yourself, that lovely purple A500++ board, the link to which can be found in the description, is still available, and the Checkmate cases I believe will go on sale again soon, as Stephen's nearly completed his fulfillment of the original Kickstarter orders. So links to everything you need is in the description. As always, thank you for watching. Leave a comment, let me know what you would do differently or what you did or didn't like about this build, and see you next time. Take care.